My guest today is Ariel Seidman, who has a deep history of working on maps and tech, going all the way back to his time working on search and maps at Yahoo in the mid-2000s. Ariel left Yahoo in 2010 and has since been on a quest to provide a competitor to Google Maps. Ariel went on to start Hivemapper in 2015 with the goal of crowdsourcing mapping. Now, there are many other projects that have taken a similar approach. In this conversation, we mentioned Waze or OpenStreetMap, for example, each either providing a service, map navigation in the case of Waze, or entertainment and the feeling of participating in a bigger open source project for OSM. But here's what caught my attention. Hivemapper pays their contributors. You buy a dashcam that you put on the windshield of your car that takes photos as you drive. Those then get uploaded to Hivemapper's servers. But they don't pay people in cash though, they use crypto. I'll be honest, anything crypto has me quite skeptical. Most of the things one hears when looking around are scams and overall things that don't give a trustworthy vibe. Now, that being said, I wanted to have an open mind because this does look like an overall promising project. Ariel has a long history of working in mapping, and I believe that conversations are a useful tool to understand where people are coming from. Ariel's team sent me one of these dashcams to try out for myself ahead of our conversation. So, for full transparency, I got one of these dashcams for free that retails about $270 at the time of writing, and I made about $19 contributing to the map. Do of that what you want, but I wanted you to know. My goal with these conversations isn't to try to impose my point of view or even for these companies to showcase how amazing and life-changing their products are. I'm not interested in that. My goal is to have open conversations, ask candid questions, and then let you figure out what you think of it all for yourself. I'm still not quite sure what I think of this project after talking to Ariel, but I hope you find this conversation at the very least insightful and thought-provoking. This episode is sponsored by Planet. If you work in the satellite image world, you probably already know about Planet. They're one of the biggest providers of high-frequency, high-resolution satellite imagery today, and their open, accessible platform integrates seamlessly with different GIS platforms, making it easier to access their high-cadence, pre-processed data, allowing you to focus on the analytics. Now, historically, getting access to high-cadence, high-resolution satellite imagery has been overly complicated and time-consuming. This is something that gets often discussed on this podcast. Planet has direct integrations for desktop GIS software like QGIS or ArcGIS Pro and continues to develop flexible APIs to build custom imagery pipelines. They also recently acquired Synergize, the company behind Sentinel Hub, giving even more options to get access to Planet imagery. Most of the work we should be doing should be focused on the analysis, not on getting the imagery. To learn more, head over to planet.com/GIS. I'll have a link in the show notes. Thank you again to Planet for sponsoring this episode. I don't know if you know, I like starting these conversations the same way every single time. I like asking people how they would describe themselves.
Okay.
I'm curious to know, how would you describe yourself?
Incredibly curious is probably at the top of that list. I'm very passionate about very specific kinds of things. Like a lot of things, just like, that's interesting, but I don't really care about it very much. But the things that I am passionate about, like, I just want to go super deep. I want to go, to the nth degree on them. And I'm pretty selective about them. I'm opinionated, but I don't think I'm not opinionated about everything, right? Like I think especially now in the age of social media, everyone kind of feels like they have to have a hot take on everything. And I'm like, I don't know a lot about that topic. So, why is my opinion going to be add anything to the conversation? But on those things that I do have knowledge and passion and interest in, I am fairly opinionated about those.
Right.
And I think the last thing is, I view life as an adventure. And I was very influenced by this Steve Jobs interview where he said, something to the effect of, look, you're taught as a young child, as a kid, as even an adolescent, to, go to school, get a good job, marry, build a family, don't knock into too many different walls. And he said, once you realize that you can kind of poke at life, right? And start to kind of create your own things, and the people who came before you are not that much smarter than you, and many times probably not very smart at all, and they created all these things that you use. Now you start to actually live a much richer life.
Is there an example of when that happened to you? Like you said, that interview is influential. Like, when did you start
Yeah.
poking around?
Well, I think those ideas started to be pretty influential to me. I was working at Yahoo. So my first job out of school was at Yahoo. This was like 2005, 2006 timeframe. And it was a fun place to be at the time because, I was in the search group and we had like 30%, 35% market share. We were investing, we were competitive with Google. I looked after local data and then ultimately maps as well from a product management perspective. But there was something missing. Like, as much as I enjoyed Yahoo and the people around me and incredibly smart and talented people, it felt like I was missing something. And, I couldn't see my life just being at that type of company for the rest of my life. And, it didn't feel as fulfilling as I was looking for. And then, I don't remember the exact time frame, but it was around that time when I started to like really look beyond the walls and be highly influenced by, frankly, by people like Steve Jobs, and his career and his journey. But yeah, that one interview, if you haven't seen it, it's an amazing interview. I think there's like a whole series of them. And there's that like 2-minute segment that has been highly influential in my life.
What do you do then? What happens if you say, like, you realize that's not really for you? What happens after?
Well, I left Yahoo
Okay.
and I started my own company. But so this kind of goes a little bit into like why I built what we built
Mm-hmm.
was I felt like, all right, Google was going to clearly win. They were investing ridiculous amounts of money from a data collection perspective. As they started to invest significantly in data collection, at great cost, quite frankly, and Yahoo and many others weren't willing to pony up. I
Let me
really felt
interrupt
like
you there. I'm actually not sure what you mean. Is this for search or is this for the maps or both?
both, truly, right? So on the search side, you needed to basically build out these massive data centers, right, at incredible costs to both crawl and index the world and to then process all that data from the web, and then have these data centers locally, next to your users. Um, so you didn't have latency and all that kind of stuff. And then from a
Right.
maps perspective, we needed to go and collect data. And we need to go build our own data set, just like Google did. In both of those cases, Yahoo management CEO was not willing to spend the kind of capital. In
I see.
retrospect, it looks like a horrible decision, right? I mean, Yahoo had capital, had access to low cost capital, because it was such a great brand name. It had great cash flows, all that kind of stuff. But they just weren't willing to spend at the level that Google was spending at. And so Google, both obviously on the search side, but also on the map side, kind of then ran away with it because they made investments, just beyond UI and all that kind of other stuff. They made very, very deep investments from a data collection perspective. Now I'm talking about maps that many other businesses and corporations weren't willing to make.
Right.
And so I kind of looked at that and I was like, geez, if that's the way the maps goes, then there's going to be very few competitors, right? And so we could talk a little bit about more, but that was kind of the thing that I was like, okay, this is interesting, right? Like, how can you bring down the cost of mapping and do this on a global scale while maintaining quality? And that's kind of been my journey ever since. I started one company right out of Yahoo called GigWalk. We had about 2 million people with iPhone and Android devices collecting data. In many cases, the mapping companies were customers, right? So was companies like Procter and Gamble and others, World Health Organization, Bloomberg Financial, et cetera. But that it worked, but there were some business model challenges in terms of like we'd never owned any of the data that we collected, right? So we were effectively like a service provider, and it was a very active mode of data collection, right? So like these people had iPhone and Android devices, they were all over the world. They had to actually go and do something, right? Like you like physically walk or drive to a location, collect data, collect photos, input that data. And every task was a little bit different. I mean, there was obviously some similarities to them, but like it wasn't like, rinse and repeat for all the different folks. So, that was a very modest outcome, but I was still very energized to kind of go build something that had global scale, something that could both bring down the cost of mapping while also increasing the quality. Because I felt like that was always the tension, right? Like you can go very, very wide and very, very global and, make your, provide very, very basic tools to collect data. But if you do that, then the quality drops pretty dramatically. And so the number of use cases that you can actually apply the data for then also goes down.
You said you try this first approach, and let me know if I understand correctly. And that had a pretty high friction for people to contribute data. And then you said the other problem was you didn't own the data. Can you try to explain me a little bit more? I'm not sure I visualize exactly how that is. Is it like some sort of app that you have that people upload data on?
Yeah.
And if so, why don't you have
Yeah.
that if they upload it?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand, what was that first attempt, and kind of what were the shortcomings?
Okay, so with GigWalk, it was an app, and you would basically get a task. You would sign up for the app, and then you would get some tasks in your local neighborhood, right? So, for example, a task could be is go and collect the menu restaurants and take a picture of the restaurant exterior and take a picture of the restaurant interior, and then basically provide us some other information like, what are the hours of business and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So that would be a task and you would get paid, $3 for it or $4 for it, whatever it is. That task was commissioned by a customer, right? So that customer would come and say, okay, we're going to spend $500,000 collecting all of this data from, 30,000 locations all across the United States and Europe. And we would keep a commission, right? So we would, of that $500,000, we would get 20% of it, let's say. And then, we would set up the task for them. We would monitor the task for them. But ultimately, the person who purchased that data or purchased that task, it was the owner of that data. So we couldn't then go resell all that data to other customers. So that was the way the business model was designed. In retrospect, I would have done it very differently, because, once you collect that data, you get 20%, but you can't go reuse that in any other product or any other system that you wanted to create.
I see. So you're effectively like an Upwork or a Fiverr.
Correct.
For a very specialized use case.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it was cool to see just like how you could build the network, right? You had all these people all over the world, like it worked. And you had real customers using it. So that was really cool. But underlying all of that, the business model was less than ideal. Like it was never going to become a large company given the way the current business model was structured.
And so you say in hindsight, you would have done it differently. You did start something new. So what's the hindsight?
Yeah. So then I went off and started Hivemapper. And so the idea was to basically build a global map and say, we're going to own the data. Okay. And we started off with drones.
Okay. And so just for context, this is around 2015.
2015, 2016. Okay. So drones at that time were just starting to get commercialized. And I thought they were really fascinating from two different perspectives. Well, they had two different perspectives on there. They were very, very low to the ground, right? Like unlike a satellite that's very far away. So they could fly below the cloud cover. So that was obviously important. And they got a lot of the street level signs and so forth. Not all of them, but they got many of them, right? One of the obviously issues with satellite imagery is you're not really getting all the speed limit signs, stop signs, turn restriction signs, and so forth. And so that kind of the ability to collect once and get both the aerial perspective and also get most of the street level perspective was really fascinating to me. So we started to grow that. There were two major problems with it. One was the battery technology of the drones never really improved significantly. And I'll come back to why that's so important. The second was local government regulation. So local government regulation was like literally, I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Palo Alto could have a different set of rules than Menlo Park. They could have a different set of rules than city of San Francisco, and so on.
Right.
And it was only getting worse. So the first issue is really critical from an economics perspective, right? Is what you really need is a totally passive experience or very close to it. And you want to ride that data collection on things that people already do, right? That's kind of the ideal scenario from a data collection perspective in order to reduce the friction.
Right.
So people
you're
would
trying to
go
get
out.
as many people as possible. So you want the friction to be as low as possible.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you look at a drone, okay, I want to go and collect, let's say, this 10 square kilometer area, okay, you would have to go to a location, right, where you could then launch your drone from. You would then need to bring, literally 8 to 10 to 12 different batteries, fly the drone, right, hit go, it flies for whatever, 20 minutes, comes back, swap the battery, and then do that over and over and over again. During that entire time, the person who's going and collecting that data can't do anything, right? They have to be like monitoring the drone and so forth. So it was a very expensive mode of data collection. And given that battery technology for these commercial drones was not improving significantly, so like a drone that you can get in 2015, 2016 for, let's say, $1,000 would fly for 25 to 35 minutes. That's roughly where it's still at, right? What you really need is a drone that can fly for like 4, 5, 6, 7 hours at a time. And so I think that's still a long way down. So we put that to the side. And the engine that we actually had from a mapping perspective behind that was quite cool, right? It was like all the software to go collect the data, and then all of the software to go process that data, turn it into something interesting from a map perspective. So then we said, okay, let's try street level from iPhone and Android devices. Going back to this idea of how do you lower friction and so forth. So there were a couple of major issues with it. One was that every time you got into the car, you had to open up the app and hit play, right? And so, hit start effectively, start collecting. It wasn't like you could just turn the car on, start driving, and then it would be collecting for you.
So let me interrupt you here. We're talking about the phone would be like people in their car put their phone on their windshield. That's what you're referring to. You tried that. So it's not people walking around.
Yes, correct.
I want to clarify that. Right.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah. So basically you drive, you get into your car, you take your iPhone or your Android app, iPhone or Android device, you open up the app that we had built, and then you would basically have to say, start collecting. Okay.
Right.
And so what we saw in that scenario was the drivers would quickly churn out of the system. Right. They would do it a little bit, but that friction of every single time I go to the grocery store, I'm going to the restaurant, I got to remember to go do this. And even if I was using not my primary phone, so I had a second phone that I was deploying for the purposes of collecting this map data, it was still a hassle, right? And so then we said, okay, look, let's try a dash cam. And so we were actually using a third-party dash cam. Let me actually go back to the iPhone and Android, because I think there's one other interesting point, which is when you had all these different iPhones and you had all these different Android devices, the imagery was not standard, right? And so you would get sometimes lower resolution, higher resolution, it was a mess. And once you start to then process all that imagery, from a customer perspective or from a user's perspective, that's less than ideal. Especially if you go to like, parts of Southeast Asia and Africa where some of the Android devices are like really old, right? You're dealing with some really crappy imagery, unfortunately. So we then switched to dash cams. It was not our own dash cam initially. It was a third-party dash cam. And that definitely solved the problem of churn on the driver side, right? Because every time you got into the car, the thing would just collect and so forth. There were two major issues. There were probably more than that, but there were a couple of major issues with the dash cam. One was the positioning technology was not sufficient, right? So, and we would go talk to these hardware, manufacturers who design this, like, hey, can you actually put better GNS into this? Well, yeah, if you order like, $30 million of dash cams, I'll consider it,
So but that's the GPS GNSS location on the dash cam. So you take a photo, you didn't know exactly where it was. That was off a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And they would always say, like, look, my business doesn't require such high precision from a positioning perspective, right? Like, even if I just tell you that you were in between, going up Fifth Avenue in between 19th and 20th, like, that's sufficient. Like, for us, that's not sufficient, right? We really ideally want to know what lane you were in, and we want to know precisely where you were at between 19th and 20th. So then we could identify, okay, what are the stores there? Where's the where are the speed limit signs and so forth, right? So that's pretty critical for us. The second thing was the APIs to get at all the data that we wanted from these third-party dash cams. We were effectively like hacking these systems. And when we go talk to the manufacturers, it was, again, yeah, I'm willing to open them up if you put a $30 million order in for dash cams. And so we said, okay, look, we think that we can build a dash cam, right, that solves some of those key problems, that has an open architecture as well. And I'll share why that's so important in a second, that solves the positioning issue, that has standardized imagery, and that has APIs such that we can backhaul all the data from the device to ultimately then, to Hivemapper server, so we can go process some of the data and so forth. And so that's what we did. So the first one was totally crappy. It was we never launched it, but it worked. And then we were able to raise about $18 million because we had a working prototype. We had a system that was actually working to go and build what you see today, which is actually two different models of a dash cam, kind of a lower cost one at like, I think $270. And now I think that there's a higher cost one at like $550 or something like that. And they're working great. And so there's two different models, and we launched the network about a year ago. And we're about to hit 6 million unique road kilometers, or about 10% of the global roads, in 1 year. There are some regions over the world like Seoul and Amsterdam and New York that are starting, even Lisbon, that are starting to get into like the 85, 90% coverage. So it's working. People love it. The churn rates are incredibly low. There's still room for improvement. We can talk a little bit about that, but the core model is working. And then on the other side, we're taking the imagery, extracting out relevant features, right? So stop signs and speed limit signs and turn restriction signs and all that. And so there's two different products that people can buy right now. There's the imagery data, and then there's the map features, which is all of the core attributes of the map.
Right. So if I zoom back, right now, you have these dash cams that people can buy, that they could put on their cars. They drive around. Those collect some data that then get uploaded to the Hivemapper server. People get paid for the data that they upload, and we'll get back to that because that's a very big part. Mm-hmm. And so that allows you to collect that data over time, because once people have that dash cam, it just starts when people's cars start, and it stops when they turn the engine off. And so it kind of continuously gathers data like that. And so then you're creating this map of, well, there's the imagery and then the features, and that's the information that you then sell to a bunch of different partners. Also something I want to come back to.
Yes, I think you summarized it very well there. There's obviously, my view is that from a data, in order to get these systems off the ground, the data collection experience needs to be incredibly easy, right? Because otherwise you're going to get like mapping geeks, right, who are willing to put up with a lot of friction. I'm a mapping geek, so like I love it. I'll put up with it, but I don't think, you can't, it's really hard to build a global map that's like constantly refreshing, right? If you're only speaking to the mapping geeks. And so, I think that was what Waze figured out in many ways, right? Was like, how do you make the data collection experience so easy and built into something that you already do?
I think that's different because people use Waze because it provides a service to them. And it so happens that as they collect the data, they kind of contribute back to the service. And then there's the other model, which is OpenStreetMap, which is people contribute kind of because it's fun and because, well, it's different. It's an open project as well, but it's a little bit like Wikipedia. There's people that spend a lot of time there, but it's turned into something that people actually enjoy doing. And it gets a little bit more complicated, but there's different models. And the model at a very high level, what I understand is the model that you've gone for is that incentives for people to do it is a financial one. So now there's a reason for people to do that because they get something back out of it, which is kind of the simplest return, which is a financial one.
Yeah, I partially agree. So a couple
Okay.
things. One is, in the case of Waze in the very, very early days, there was not a lot of value that you were getting in return because the map wasn't really built out. It was a very, very, very basic map, right? So you were probably better off using something else. But a lot of the early contributors kind of saw the vision, right, and kind of bought into that vision. And it was fairly easy thing to do. And they did kind of gamify it in the beginning, right? Where they put these candies out into the different parts of the city where they really wanted to map. And there was like, I think a little bulldozer, like your car would become a bulldozer and like show you the roads that you were mapping for them. So I think they definitely gamified it and it made it fun when the utility back to the driver was fairly low. And then it kind of switched. And you're right. Then at that point, it became much more about the utility. And then, oh yeah, I'm also just making the map fresher and better as I drive as well. And so like, I'm cool with that, right? In the case of, I think, look, yes, there is a financial incentive and we'll talk more about that. But even when you have a financial incentive, you want to make the data collection experience incredibly easy, incredibly
for sure.
low friction. Otherwise, it's not going to become economical, right? And so, the financial incentives, and let's talk a little bit about Hivemapper in terms of we've adopted cryptocurrency. So there's this cryptocurrency that effectively, as you drive, you're earning the cryptocurrency called Honey, which is kind of our cryptocurrency. And I'm going to use a term very lightly. This is effectively saying is you now have a stake in the map, right? You're helping build this map, okay? And as people start to then use the map, you see kind of a financial return because there's like a flow back into you from the honey that you've accumulated or earned by participating and helping build the map, right? And so that's kind of the structure of how honey works in a very, very simple way. I believe that's important, right? I believe that these people are doing real work. I believe that in many cases, historically, and I'll use Waze as an example, a lot of people, not just the drivers, but you had all these Waze map editors who created tremendous value for Waze and then saw nothing in return. And I don't think, I'm not accusing Waze of any wrongdoing, to be very clear. These people all did it. They were volunteers. Some of them understood what they were doing in terms of the massive enterprise value they were creating. Others didn't probably. But I think now we've all matured and we've all kind of started to understand the value of the data and the enterprise value that it creates for these organizations. And I think it's probably time that we kind of reevaluate some of that and say, wait. Do we want to be creating data for this entity with getting nothing in return? And so I think that's kind of where we probably disagree with some people within the mapping community, because we feel pretty strongly that these folks out there who are either collecting the data, or in our case, we also have like these data labelers and data editors through this thing called Map AI trainers. They're effectively creating, something that is valuable for many organizations all over the world that then see utility and value with that at the end of the day. And they should participate in the financial aspect of that as well.
So the big question, the big elephant in the room is, why crypto?
So look, I'm one of these people, I'm not religious about crypto. Like, crypto to me is a technology. And I think that unfortunately what happened was a lot of people got religious about crypto. And so then crypto became this thing that, was going to solve world hunger, that was going to create peace all over the world, that was going to eradicate, diseases. The truth of the matter is, like, none of that is true, right? Like a technology, you have to find the appropriate use cases and applications for it, and then really understand why that piece of technology is so valuable in that specific use case. Okay. So in the case of, in our case, what we believe is that crypto provides a level of transparency and immutability. Okay. So once somebody is rewarded honey tokens, that is all out there on the blockchain. Okay. So there's no like shenanigans that Hivemapper can play, because it's all out there. It's all public, right? You drove X amount of kilometers, you earned Y amount of honey. All of that information is transparent. Okay. All of that information is immutable. So once you've earned that honey, nobody can take it back from you. And so I think that's really important in the sense of building trust in the system, right? People don't have to trust me. They don't have to trust the Hivemapper brand. They don't have to trust our investors or any of that. You should trust this blockchain where all of this data resides. So I think that's a very important aspect of this. I remember we were doing this through a cash-based system before we went to crypto.
Right. Okay.
And we got accused so frequently of like, I'm going to report you. This is fraud. That's fraud. And we're like, look at you collected imagery. Here's the imagery that you collected. It's like literally looking up at the sky, not the road. And so therefore you did not earn X and Y amount. Right. And so, but I think the larger issue was just like people didn't trust us. And so by putting all this on the blockchain, making it open and transparent and immutable, we never get accused, of shenanigans or anything like that, because people can see it and people can trust it. So I think that's one really important critical capability of this technology that doesn't exist in other places.
Right. I want to push back on that a little bit. First of all, because, devil's advocate, but also because I think there's been a history of, in crypto, there's been a really low signal to noise ratio in terms of projects that were actually successful. There's so many stories of scams and people seemingly also having these, transparent ledgers, but still, because what you own is a token and the value of that changes so much, there's been a lot of, pump and dump schemes. There's a lot of distrust at the moment in crypto and in anything that's even remotely tied to that.
Yep.
And so I'm curious to know what you think about that.
So first of all, yes. And there is distrust, and I totally appreciate that, and I understand that. And I think that's, on some level for me, who's trying to create something that is useful for the world, that's deeply frustrating, right? I come at this and being like, you guys are idiots, like stop all this nonsense. So yeah, I totally understand that, and I get that. A couple of things. One is, look, if you look at a lot of the headline grabbing fraud that occurred in crypto, FTX being probably the prime example of that, that had nothing to do with crypto, right? That was an exchange, a centralized exchange, right? That was effectively, would get people's money into their exchange so they could trade, buy Bitcoin, do all this other stuff. And then they were using those customer funds to basically go make these ridiculously risky bets. And guess what? Those bets didn't turn out. And then they basically had no money returned. I mean, it was just like, garden variety fraud. Garden variety is not the right term, but it was just like flat out fraud, right? Banks can do that today. If you look at the entities that are decentralized, right, that are truly crypto, you wouldn't be able to do that, right? That would be effectively impossible because it would all be open, it would all be transparent. And so you would very quickly be able to see like, whoa, 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 all those customer funds are now going to over here. What's going on, right? And so there's a lot of examples of that where, you have these centralized exchanges that have committed fraud. And it's been deeply frustrating for, quite frankly, I don't consider myself per se part of the crypto industry, but, for those who are like the crypto enthusiasts and really like kind of holding the mantle, it's been very frustrating for them. And I sympathize with them, right? Because the technology that is, around crypto is actually designed to solve some of these. And people have now created decentralized exchanges that are very opaque, the exact opposite. So look, I think the industry will have to rid itself of that. I also want people to get a little bit of perspective on this. I was a Yahoo search. We had this thing called search spam, right? Effectively, they're frauds, right? And we had whole teams set up to detect things that were effectively getting into our index, which were spam, okay? Which were trying to defraud people in a variety of ways. Yahoo Mail had a whole team focused on that as well. And so the point there is that fraud has always been a big part of the technology industry, right? Now, I think the Web 2 world did a much, much, much better job of kind of suppressing that, right? And managing it and pushing it to the side and pushing it down. But certainly you had a lot of bad actors, trying to take advantage of everything from search to email to, mobile apps, et cetera, over the course of history, and crypto has obviously had its set of problems as well. So I wouldn't be too quick to judge the entire industry based upon some bad actors, because we've had bad actors in previous iterations of technology as well.
Right. So if I understand correctly, the way you're seeing it is there's been a history in a lot of the online technology and just tech in general of like new stuff coming in, being abused, kind of hoping that that is a phase for a lot of the crypto industry and that there is like this very real utility at the end of the tunnel, and kind of that's a history that can get left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it will, right? I think it's gone through this phase as part of the growing pains of, any new technology where, oftentimes bad actors jump on it, see an opportunity. AI will follow this exact same path, right? Where you will have bad actors trying to use that technology for nefarious purposes, scamming people and so forth. I mean, this is already happening. Crypto has had to deal with its version of that, right? And, I do think that it's probably been more extreme because the industry did not address it as aggressively and vocally as they should have. Like, I think that is a real legitimate criticism of the industry as a whole. The good actors, right, did not, and now they've learned their lesson and they're taking a much more aggressive approach to basically trying to push the bad actors out.
I think another thing. So you guys sent me a dashcam to try this out and kind of like get some data, put it on a car, collect some data, like do the whole process.
Yeah.
And which is like very interesting, by the way, to do. And I think a few things on my end that I'm very curious to hear about, and kind of to stay on that side of crypto. We were talking about friction of doing it. I noticed when I'm doing this, there's a lot of things that I don't really completely understand on how that payment and the crypto works. And so it feels like I have to give that trust away, that like, okay, you're not going to completely scam me out of what I'm doing, just using a wallet and things like that. There's a lot of people who are like, these notions are like, you've already lost people
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
just talk about a wallet. And I'm really curious if you've experienced some of that as well. And yeah, kind of just how you've thought about
Yeah,
all of that.
it's a good question. So there's kind of three on the contributor side. There's a couple different groups of people, right? There's definitely like the crypto enthusiasts, right? And so these people are, very passionate about bringing real world utility into crypto, right? And so these are people who these are not like the scammers. These are like just normal people who think that, crypto is the future, and we could talk about economic freedom. We can talk about all these interesting things that they believe in, they're very passionate about. And so they discovered Hivemapper and said, ooh, that's interesting. I use a map every day. I could see why this is useful. I could see why you need people all over the world, et cetera. So those people, a wallet to them is obvious. Like, of course I need a
Yeah.
wallet, right? So that group of people has never been an issue. Then they have gone out and recruited Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and so forth. Okay. People who are driving a lot, truck drivers, etc. So oftentimes what they'll do is say, okay, I will buy the dash cam for you, Uber driver, Lyft driver, because you're always on the road, right? And then we'll effectively like split the honey tokens, right? Like you get a free dash cam, you get the utility of the dash cam, and we'll split it 50-50, whatever they come up with, right? For those folks, there is a little bit of an onboarding process, right? Like, okay, what's a wallet, et cetera. And there's some things that we've done recently. Like historically, you had to use this wallet called Phantom. You don't have to do that anymore. You can just sign up with an email address, and then kind of underneath the hood, that will create a wallet for you. So it's much more, it's simpler for more people. They're like, okay, I have an email address. I don't have to remember all this crazy stuff to sign in, all that kind of stuff. So definitely when we launch that, many members of the community that start to onboard after that start to use that as a way to kind of onboard. And then you have the map AI editors. Okay. So these are people mostly in places like Indonesia, the Philippines, kind of the micro tasking community, right? And for them, it's funny enough, like they're very familiar with wallets and crypto and all this kind of stuff, right? Oftentimes they prefer to be paid in crypto, right? It's easier. And they already have it oftentimes. So like for them, oddly enough, you don't have to explain anything to do with crypto and wallets because they already have it and they prefer that. The last thing I will say about crypto from a technology and utility perspective is we were paying people cash all over the world. Okay. Nigeria, Argentina, Brazil, US, Europe, etc. The amount of friction associated with sending cash to places like Argentina and Nigeria. I mean, literally, like we had to have somebody go into a bank, they took like a whole, like almost like a headshot, fingerprints, everything, right? I mean, it was crazy just to send like $50 or $20 to somebody in Nigeria. With crypto, you don't have to do any of that. It is incredibly easy. And especially people outside the United States and Europe, they oftentimes prefer it to their local cash or even to dollars because the exchange rates are so high for them.
Interesting. Yeah, I figured the international transaction might be a common, like an attractive use case for crypto compared to like cash. I'm curious about the exchange rate because now basically you have a token that is tied, like that value is like I went to look at it, it's pretty volatile. Like it's changed quite a lot over, I think at the time we're speaking, it's been, I think, about a year or two. I forgot exactly, but it's changed quite a lot. And so there's also that aspect that comes into the equation compared to something like the dollar, although you could make the argument that's also goes quite up and down.
Yeah, I mean, it is more volatile than the U.S. dollar, that's for sure. I think these things. I mean, it's very nascent as well, right? And so you have a couple set of people. You have some people like the Uber drivers and the Lyft drivers, and even some of the truck drivers, is they will just cash out at the end of the week or the month or whatever they decide, right?
Yeah.
So they'll basically just convert from honey to USDC. USDC effectively tracks the dollar. And so they'll just cash out at the week. And so, that's it. They're gone. They don't. Others are like, no, I'm just going to hold it, right? Like, I'm just interested in kind of seeing where this project goes. It's still very nascent. As they get more and more, maps and more customers and so forth, the value of this data will become more and more valuable. So they're making a financial decision. And so I think it just depends on where somebody is in life.
Yeah.
And, to me, I think that's good, right? Like if you want to just, use it as, a little bit of additional cash, pocket cash at the end of the week or the end of the month and, take your family out to dinner or, buy whatever, great. And if you want to hold it, great as well, right? Like this is where I'm very much economic freedom is a choice that we each make every single day. And some people are like, look, I don't drive enough, so this doesn't make sense for me. So great. This isn't a good fit for you. Right. So, what we've really tried to do also with the dash cam, especially for those kind of professional drivers, is make the dash cam a good dash cam because a lot of those drivers want the dash cam as well, right? If they get into an accident or they get pulled over, whatever it is,
right. As a
some of them have
regular
licenses, right? And so they need to protect themselves because all of a sudden you get into an accident and you're viewed at fault, your insurance rates can skyrocket. That's taking real money out of your pocket every single month.
I want to come back to something that we talked a little about, which was so I want to kind of nerd out on the tech a little bit, and come at it through some of the regulatory side actually. So we talked a little bit about that, and now you have a lot of cameras that are collecting a lot of that data, but you're basically driving down the road. So you're collecting all sorts of stuff. And so if you go on Google Street View right now, you won't see people's faces. You won't see license plate. There's actually a lot of processing that's done between the data that's collected and the data that people can see to make it as accurate as possible, but also as anonymous as possible. And so I'm just curious to know how you guys have approached this.
So this is really important to me personally, right? I do not want to create a global, surveillance system. And that's just not interesting to me. So a couple of things on this. So one is, let's talk about it, privacy from the perspective of bystanders, and then talk about it privacy also from the perspective of the contributor as well. Okay.
Yeah, that's also something I wanted to touch on.
So from the perspective of the contributor, we don't know who you are, right? We never collect when you install the app. We never collect your email address. We never get your email address. Okay. You don't provide a profile photo. You're not even allowed to create your own username. We give you an anonymous username, a 3-word username. We automatically trim. I think it's the first 300 meters and the last 300 meters of your drive. You can also create these privacy zones.
I saw that.
Within these privacy zones, we will never collect. And we don't know what those privacy zones are. They sit at the edge. We never know about them. They're never sent back to Hivemapper. And then there's network level privacy zones as well. So those would be US military bases, CIA headquarters, places like that that are very sensitive. So we don't, look, I don't want to ever get a call from a government saying, hey, we think there's somebody who, we want to talk to, right? Who is that person? And I want to be in a position where I'm like, look, I literally don't know who that person is. And I have no ability to contact them, right? I can't send them an email or call them or whatever. And so that's really important to us to protect the privacy of the contributor. Then there's the bystanders. The bystanders, what we do, and we do this at the edge, so in other words, on the dash cam, is that we privacy mask people's faces, and not just the license plates, but the entire vehicle.
Right.
So the entire vehicle is masked. We're going to introduce privacy masking of the entire body, right? So not just the face. It's working, but it's not quite where we want it to be, so that we haven't released it yet. And so that's how we protect the privacy of the bystanders. Look, I want to be transparent. There's other situations that we're still discovering today. So for example, somebody, gets into their car and takes off their baseball hat of their local softball team or baseball team or whatever it is and puts it on the dashboard. Those have shown up, right? And so all of a sudden you see, okay, well, I could figure out what local baseball team or softball team that belongs to, and I could try to figure it out, right? And so there's those that we're now figuring out of, okay, things that should not be in the image, how do we also remove those, right? So that we can never track back to, oh, this person was, took their baseball hat, like I was just sharing with you. So this is really important to us. And I don't think that the industry, when I say the industry, the mapping industry has always held itself to the highest levels necessary from a privacy perspective. And I think we're starting to shift back in the right direction on this one.
So I went to drive around. Well, actually, I didn't because I don't have a car. So I want to know when are you guys going to support bikes? Because I live in the Netherlands, but that's something for later. So I drove around with your dash cam. It collects images. From what I understood, it's a pretty low frame rate. It's like a few images a second. Because then you have to go on your phone. Your phone, basically, like the dash cam serves as a Wi-Fi hotspot. Your phone connects to it. It uploads the data. So for a while, all those images are sitting on your phone, which has pretty limited storage for like pretty high-res images.
Yeah.
And then those get uploaded, and now you have these standardized dash cams. So you kind of know the focal lengths, the exact sensor that you have, because like you kind of built those and you have that standardized knowledge of the dynamic resolution of the camera, like everything that nobody really ever thinks about, that but makes it very complicated to stitch stuff together.
Yep.
So can you kind of walk me through what happens when you receive those images and how you turn that into a map?
Yeah. So a couple of things in terms of the frame rate. So the frame rate is dynamic. When you're going slower, it will reduce its frame rate. When you're going faster on the highway, it increases it. We basically max out at roughly about 10 or 11 frames per second is like the max that we need. And so that's sufficient. So we really looked at it from the perspective of like, we do not want to create a situation where we are uploading an unnecessary amount of imagery, because there is, like you shared, real significant friction associated with people's phones, right? Like if you all of a sudden be like, hey, for every kilometer you drive, we're going to collect 5 gigs of imagery, that would be a problem very quickly. So I think right now we're averaging about 25 to like 60, depending upon how fast you're driving, where you're driving, all that kind of stuff, megabytes per kilometer, right? So for truck drivers, right, who are driving very long distances, right, at relatively high speeds, that can add up quickly. For your regular Uber driver, Lyft driver, or, people like myself just driving around their local city, it's not that much, is the feedback that we get. We are next year introducing a new dash cam that will also have a cellular option where you can just automatically upload via cellular. So it'll basically take the phone out of the picture, which is really important for fleets, right? The larger the fleet is, they don't want their drivers doing exactly what you shared. So just to add a little bit more down that dimension, because I think that's important. So next year, the experience, if for this dash cam with a cellular option, it will be 100% passive, right? Like you will just literally have to install the thing, turn the car on, and then boom, you're off to the races. So in terms of creating the map, The imagery, the map image API, there's some processing, some fairly straightforward processing that occurs on the back end. And then we provide a whole bunch of APIs in order to query the data, right? So for some customers, it's like, hey, just give me the most recent image you have at this intersection, right? Or give me the entire drive path, right? And I need at least an image every 3 meters because I'm putting this into a machine learning process to build a 3D scene, right? There's some sensor fusion stuff to further improve the positioning as well that occurs on the back end. That's an area of intense focus for us right now from an engineering and technical perspective. And then let's talk about what we refer to as the Map AI pipeline. So the Map AI pipeline's job is to extract out all of the various objects that you see in around yourself, right? So today we're doing speed limit signs, stop signs, traffic lights, turn restriction signs, pretty soon construction as well, right? So being able to identify, this road has construction from here to here. This lane, there used to be 3 lanes, now it's reduced from 3 to down to 2 lanes. That is also coming as well. And then we'll do other, pieces of information as well, like the number of lanes, what each lane is for, right? Is this bike lane? Is this, bus lane? Is this an HOV lane? All that kind of stuff. That's coming next year. And so there's a couple of different phases to it. One is object classification, right? We need to classify that this is a 35 mile per hour speed limit sign, or we need to classify as a turn restriction sign, between the hours of 4 and 6 p.m., all that kind of information. But at this point, we have very, very coarse positioning on the objects, right? So we know obviously just from where the sensor was located that, it's, on Fifth Avenue, let's call it between 19th and 20th, plus or minus, 50 feet in either direction, okay? But we don't know exactly precisely where it is. So there's a set of Map AI trainers who are then effectively telling us whether or not we're classifying these objects correctly, right? So there's like little games. So it's like, hey, we think there's a 35 mile per hour speed limit sign. Tell us whether or not it is. And then we kind of wait for consensus, right? So, okay, 10 people with good reputations all said there's a 35 mile per hour speed limit sign. Good, the classifiers are doing this correctly. It gets really complicated. I mean, for people who really go deep into maps, right? There's warning speed limit signs, which are yellow, right? Or there's like, hey, in 100 feet, the speed limit will change. That's actually not what you're looking for. Or there's like a speed limit for a school zone, right? Between these hours, right? Or there's like a speed limit for trucks versus regular vehicles. And they're like sometimes stacked right on top of each other. So there's all those kind of corner cases that make it really, really hard from a classification perspective. Then we move on to positioning. So positioning, it's kind of a combination of 3D reconstruction. On one of the cameras, we actually have stereo as well, right? We have stereo cameras. I don't think that was the model that you used. So that also helps with positioning as well. But what we're doing in the 3D reconstruction is trying to remove, and this is actually where we use some of the Facebook's technology, which I think is really interesting. We remove things like the sky, right? We remove things like other vehicles from the scene, right? So we kind of rid the scene of all of the things that we don't care about, right? And so that we're then only left with those objects that we do care about, right? We don't even actually care about other vehicles. And in some cases, we don't even care about buildings, right? What do we really care about? We care about poles, right? Is this a utility pole? Is this a speed limit pole, right? We care about traffic lights, et cetera. So what that enables us to do is when we go to actually position the object in the real physical world, we're not dealing with a very, very complicated 3D scene. And so we're able to then just focus on the objects that we care about and then position them properly. And sometimes also disambiguate them from another. So that then takes, for one speed limit sign that we may have seen 30, 40, 50 times, right? We may have then positioned it, right, 30, 40, 50 times. And each time from different angles, we then are able to further improve its positioning over time, right? So that's the other thing that we always talk about internally, which is just by, when most like Google's cars is a good example. They go and they drive a place once, right? So they have one shot on goal. And so what do they do with one shot on goal? They basically, put very, very, very expensive equipment on it, right? In our case, we're dealing with a dash cam, which is like either $250 or $500, not as expensive as all the equipment that's sitting on site. What's our advantage? We have a lot of shots on goal, right? We can see that same speed limit sign from many different perspectives, many different times a day, right? So if like one time you're driving into the sun or the lighting is hitting it bad, we don't care that much because we're going to get another opportunity to see it, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, and then further refine its positioning over time. So once it comes out of the positioning, we then actually present it to these Map AI trainers and we say, okay, this is all the imagery that we collected. Here's the speed limit sign, and here's the speed limit sign on a satellite view. Is this correct? Now, this is tricky because the aerial imagery, as I think you know this well, sometimes you can tell, okay, yeah, that looks right. The shadows of the sign, okay, this is way off. It was, clearly a stop sign has to be at the corner, all that kind of information. But what they do is they find those issues that like 5 or 10%, which are problematic, right? And then they basically push them back into positioning and say, no, you didn't do a good enough job on this, right? So they're not really helping us that much with those that are well positioned, that are coming out of the positioning, but they are helping us with those that are poorly positioned. And then it goes into a last phase, what we refer to as auditing. So before we actually make it a map feature, what we've effectively done is, and this you actually have to do by region is what we're discovering, is you basically say, okay, here are all of the stop signs and speed limit signs. And we're very, very, very high confidence that for, let's say, in the Southwest of America, right? Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, et cetera, that, there's extreme high confidence in all of these different stop signs. And then what we do is we say, okay, we introduce a new stop sign or a new speed limit sign. And we say, okay, is this correct or not? Right. And so then the system starts to learn, okay, a speed limit sign, like one right after the other, if you have two speed limit signs, like literally 20 meters apart, that's a very, very high probability that there's some sort of error in the data, right? Or if you have a stop sign and if it's not properly placed at an intersection, you probably also have a problem. So it's kind of learning from all these previous examples so that when it sees a new map feature get created that potentially has an error, it can say, wait, this has an error. So then those go again to the Map AI trainers to identify where that error is in that previous pipelines, and then it pushes it back to one of those phases. And those that don't have any exceptions, they then actually make it into the final data product.
And so from what I hear you're saying, this looks like this is specifically made for like autonomous driving companies. I'm guessing those are probably the main customers because we're talking about speed limit signs. Like that's kind of the use case that comes to mind. The type of
those for sure. So there's we also have customers that aren't doing that as well, right? So they just need, imagery. They're doing like location monitoring of specific changes at specific locations, that kind of stuff. And we could talk about that customer group as well. But yes, there's what's really interesting to me is historically, from a mass perspective, there was really one primary customer, and that was human beings, right? Like you and I would use maps, or a trucking company would use maps, or Uber, uses maps and pays a lot for them. But now, yes, you have a whole new class of customers, which is the car itself, right? And so that car, what's really cool about this, and I don't think people fully appreciate this yet, is the data that is going into these systems, these ADAS systems, as well as robotaxi systems, are being monetized, right? So Ford has a Blue Cruise product. So I think they have about 300,000 cars that are now equipped with the appropriate sensors. Blue Cruise is an ADAS product, which basically will take over driving in certain locations or certain streets and effectively drive for you, right? The product, they charge the customer. So I think you get 2 months free or a month free, and then they charge you $800 a year. A key input into that product is incredibly high quality fresh map data, right? You got to know, okay, like on this highway, is there a construction zone? Okay, what's the impact? How many lanes did it go down to, right? Is that highway exit closed or is it open, right? Is the speed limit changed on that highway? What we're also seeing in addition to that is Europe has some pretty strict new regulations that even if the car isn't ADAS equipped, even if it's just like a basic car that's coming off the assembly line starting in 2024, it needs to have speed limit data and other data directly ingested into that vehicle, right? So the idea is that if the vehicle's going too fast, that you can effectively put a governor onto that car, so to basically slow the car down. So that probably will work in Europe. I think in the US, I don't think that will work just from like a social, cultural perspective.
Yeah.
But so all of a sudden that car itself is becoming a big consumer of map data. And unlike you and I, like if there's a mistake in the data, okay, well, we can figure it out. We're looking at it, right? We can be like, okay, that the road is clearly closed there. A vehicle can't, right? And so the quality bar for the map data as well as that freshness starts to go up incredibly high.
Right. So could you provide me kind of a quick, very, very rough overview of who some of their different customer categories are? So it seems like the automotive industry is a very big one. You mentioned there were some others.
Yeah, so I put it into a couple categories. So there's automotive, there is and I put ADAS into that category as well, right? ADAS/automotive. Then you have the robo taxis, right, which is a little bit different because they're actually putting their own vehicles out into the road. There is no driver at all in the robo taxis, and so they have a lot of really interesting and hard use cases that we tend to be really good fits for. And then you have a couple of other types of customers. You have logistic companies, right? So logistics and mobility, right? So these could be trucking companies. These can be Ubers of the world, the Gojeks of the world, customers like that. And so what is really important for them? One is ETA. Okay, from the time that you actually, get a car or you get a truck, whatever, that you're trying to get from, point A to point B, you need to provide very, very, very precise ETAs as to like when that car will be there or when that truck will be there, right? And so if you now have a much better understanding of what's actually happening, right, in this world, because you built a map there, literally in some cases yesterday, or hopefully in a couple hours ago, like, hey, there's construction here. It's not an accident, right? This is construction, and the construction now is impacting it this way. That is incredibly useful and valuable data. In other cases, it's kind of like location monitoring, right? So, okay, there's 5,000 incredibly high value and yet very, very complicated pickup and drop off zones, right? I want to be monitoring those 5,000 locations constantly in understanding whether or not I'm going to have issues. Like, so for example, if you're Pepsi, you're trying to get your vehicles, your trucks, your delivery vehicles into certain locations. Like if there's all of a sudden some problems there, you want to know about that, right? Because that's going to potentially mess up your entire logistics, right? Or if you're Uber or if you're Lyft, there are high value, very, very complicated locations that you want to be consistently monitoring. So, we're not competing with Google Maps at every single layer. I think that would be foolish and we wouldn't be able to do that. So I think you have to pick our spots in terms of where are we highly differentiated, where we can start competing with today. And that as the network gets bigger and bigger, and as that entire Map AI pipeline gets stronger, that we can add new capabilities and start to compete on other layers. So for example, traffic. We just don't have enough vehicles yet on the road to compete in traffic. We would have to get a lot bigger. Maybe there's a couple of regions here and there that we could, but not yet.
Yeah, for context, I was looking up right before we recorded. I think there's just shy of 25,000 contributors, at least on the public dashboard that's mentioned there. And I'm guessing that's all time. That's not even just active.
Yes.
So
and that's also split between those people doing the Map AI training and the people who are doing driving.
So do you have an idea of, like, on any given day, how many people do you have that are out with a dash cam?
It's about 4 to 5, 4,500 to 5,500.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So for traffic, that's just not enough density to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's like Lisbon, and a couple of other cities. Seoul, South Korea does have, enough, but yes, definitely not like global. So that's really the next challenge for us next year, which is, how do we continue to bring the price of the dash cam down? How do we continue to make it even easier to contribute? So that we can get, right now, like if you take a given city like an Austin or a Phoenix or a Houston or something like that, I can share with you the exact data, but we're refreshing the entire city, maybe once or twice a month, right?
Okay.
And what we really want to be is like, okay, how do we refresh the entire city, 2 or 3 times a week? What we've also introduced is this concept called bursts. And so bursts are where
Yes.
customers say, hey, look, I'm monitoring these, 5,000 locations, across, US and Europe, whatever, right? And I want to be able to see those locations at least 2 or 3 times a week. So what we then do is in the app, we alert the drivers like, hey, if you drive around these locations, you will earn a little bit more honey. I knew it was going to work from my experience at GigWalk, but I didn't appreciate how well it would work and how fast it would work. So we put out, I think, across 5 US cities, I think about 1,000, and I think 99% were hit.
Right. So now you can kind of tweak the scale and say, change the incentives. You say, this area, we want a lot more coverage. And so we're going to alert people that there's a much higher reward, or not even necessarily much higher, but at a higher. So there's a bigger incentive to maybe take a detour on your way to work or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. So what happens is, and I think this is where, by virtue of having collection as well as the processing engine, right, as well as the customers, kind of the full integrated stack, you can then start to communicate to the drivers where you're missing pieces in the map, right? Or where you need, because there's changes occurring, you need, much, much higher refresh cadence. And so, look, I love OpenStreetMap. I love what Steve and many others in the community have built over the years in OpenStreetMap. But one of my big criticisms of it is the edits of the map are happening on imagery that was collected oftentimes 9, 12, sometimes even 18 months ago, right? So it's stale. And so I think that what we've tried to do is, look, we know that there's a lot of changes happening here, right? Or we think there's a lot of changes happening here. How do we direct people to those parts of the city such that we're getting incredibly high frequency and we really understand? I mean, there's some like random residential, suburb, street. Okay, like not a lot of change happened there. We don't need to see it 3 times a week.
Yeah, but now you have this tool that basically you can incentivize people to go in one area more than another. Something that I'm guessing Waze can't really do. Like they're just routing people to wherever they want to go. There's no
Yeah.
at
They
least
had that
in
concept of candies, where they
right.
would
Yeah.
like candies out and people would kind of like see them and they would kind of be a little bit off. I don't know if they still do that, but that was their kind of version of what we've done
Right.
with
I see.
Burst. So, I mean, look, the advantage that we have over Waze ultimately is that we can see something. So the problem with Waze is that you need to have multiple people who see it and then multiple people tap the button, right? So for example, if there's construction or road work, I need 3 or 4 or 5 people to effectively confirm that, right? Because I'm not just going to trust my vote. So I need to reach consensus. And so, but with an image doesn't lie, and an image will also tell you the impact, right? Like in other words, is that construction, is that just like some, some people doing something very quickly, or is that like, no, they've actually shut down a couple lanes. And so the image doesn't lie, and the image tells you the truth immediately, and it also usually conveys the impact.
You have a trade-off of coverage in terms of users, though. Like that
you do.
get much higher density of information because you get an image compared to I don't know like how many categories there are on ways that you can say, but like a dozen. But you have a lot more people using it.
Correct. Yeah.
I see.
So that's, ultimately, obviously, we need to solve that. That's time and, making the dash cam costs go down and, et cetera. We don't need, I think it's we don't need millions upon millions of drivers,
Okay.
right? So like we've done the math on this. So for like a city, LA is large. LA is about 100,000 road kilometers if you just look at LA Metro, okay? Not just the city of LA. So, we've done the math on this. We think what we need like in LA is about 2 to 4,000 drivers. I mean, it depends it really depends what kind of driver you have, right? That's what it comes down to. Like if you have Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and delivery drivers, that's like 80% or 90% of your fleet. Then you probably is closer to 2,000. But if you have a mixture, then you probably need something like 4,000 or 5,000.
Yeah, because your driver is going to go in so many different ways. Whereas if it's someone going to and from work, they're going to be doing the same road every single day.
Exactly.
If you have their neighbor that happens to work in the same office, there's basically nothing new.
Exactly. Yeah. And we, like the way that Honey gets rewarded, it takes that into consideration, right? And so we tell people like, look, if you drive like a school bus or a regular bus, like, in other words, exactly what you described, you just do the same route every single day, then this isn't a good fit for you, right? But if you are the kind of person who drives into many different parts, you explore things on the weekends, like you're always going out, whatever it is, then this is probably a good fit for you, right? And it's even a better fit for you if you're like an Uber driver, Lyft driver, or an Amazon driver.
So when is it coming to bikes?
Bikes. A lot of people ask us that, especially in Southeast Asia, definitely Amsterdam, but also Southeast Asia for sure. They want motorcycles because there's so many motorcycles there.
For sure.
And so there's a couple issues. One is power, right? So it doesn't have any battery on it, so it has to have a power source. So probably motorcycles before. And then the other is that we prefer a horizontal stable platform, right? So with a bike or a motorcycle, it's always moving and it's not stable. There are ways to correct that, right? You can get a gimbal or something like that, but then all of a sudden get a little bit more expensive. And there's some stuff that you can do from a software perspective. It just, quite frankly, like we haven't gotten around to it yet, but it is something that as Southeast Asia becomes more and more important, then I think we'll prioritize it. But yeah, just unfortunately hasn't been a high priority yet.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I didn't even think about the angle. I fully expected you to tell me you need a battery. But the angle makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
What's beautiful about it is that the image quality is so good because it's exterior, obviously, right? So you don't have any reflection from the window shield from your front window. So you get a very clean take on it. And also the positioning is also better because it's exterior, right?
Yeah.
Again, you don't have any window that's causing any interference in the GNSS signal. So there's a lot of really good reasons as to like why exterior mounted dash cams are superior. And we're trying to actually, like for vehicles, trying to get more people to mount them exterior.
Have you seen someone like put it on a motorcycle or a scooter and just power it on an external battery? Because it's just a regular power. That's the only thing it needs is power.
Yeah. There was like a whole because the community was so enthusiastic about this, we ran this kind of little like science experiment, where the community members could propose different ideas to solve this problem. And so, yeah, people had like battery, source on their motorcycle or on their bike. And then people were creating these different gimbals and all this kind of stuff. So it was very cool to see like the community just get very creative about this because they were so motivated about it. In order to then take some of those ideas that came out of that little science project fair that we ran and then productize it and kind of scale it up, that's a whole other project. But there are solutions to the problem is what it comes down to.
So to kind of dig on that on a little tangent, like, have you had some pretty crazy stuff? Like people strap it to, I don't know, a plane I'm done. I'm like guessing because, we're talking about tens of thousands of people. So that's starting to be a lot of people that have a pretty broad background of stuff. And so you you have people that are going to tinker around with this.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So the truck drivers are probably some of the more interesting ones because they know how to tinker. They have time on their hands. And so you're allowed to mount it both forward facing as well as side facing. So some of them, even if they put it like down by like where the door is, that's still pretty high up for a truck. And so a lot of people are experimenting with that. You don't need this, but for some reason, people got into their heads that they wanted to bring a fan. So somebody created like a fan attachment to the thing.
It does get pretty
unnecessary.
hot.
What's that?
It does get pretty hot.
It does. Like I've personally driven with a dash cam in Arizona, like 105 for 8 hours, and the thing never missed. Didn't have any problems with it. And so the other things that we're also seeing is like people creating like exterior mounts for it, right? So it basically like shields it from the weather and all that kind of stuff. That's something that we're looking to address so that more people can mount it exterior, just like you don't have to buy any extra, mounts and all that kind of stuff. We see some weird stuff as well. Like in the very, very early days before we launched, we were driving around San Francisco, and I want to make sure this is clear for the audience. Like this is before we launched. But just, city of San Francisco, this goes back to like, it was just starting to come out of the pandemic. I don't know how much you read about San Francisco, but it was like, the city was just chaotic. Like, it's probably the nice way to put it. And, we saw people like having sex on the side street. Just like horrible shit, So you saw like, you start to see, and this is really where that going back to that privacy part is really, really important, is like, you don't want to see that stuff, right? You don't want that stuff showing up in your map. You don't want it being like anywhere. And so that was kind of like a big eye opener for us, was like, how do we really, from a privacy perspective, clamp down on this? Because you just go to today, even Google Street View, there's like entire websites dedicated to all the crazy crap that those cameras have seen over the years, right?
Right.
And, we want to avoid that kind of situation because the world is a crazy, chaotic place. And, there's a lot of things that aren't relevant for a map. And our perspective is, if it's not relevant for a map, we don't care about it and we don't want to see it.
Yeah. Yeah. You're maybe that's already happened, but you're going to catch a car accident on camera. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, we do catch car accidents and stuff like that, and people, drivers get into car accidents, unfortunately, and then they can keep the imagery for themselves as well. There's a way to do that.
Yeah, what does it look like? Let's roll the clock a little bit. So this has been going on for 8 years. The dashcams have been out for a couple years, I think.
Just 1 year,
right? So that's still pretty new in the history of the company, and yet you've gotten tens of thousands of people on board. What do you think this looks like a few years from now? If I asked you to look in your crystal ball of maps, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think the camera technology. So all of the camera technology is open source. Okay, so
yeah, you mentioned that earlier.
All the reference designs, all the software, the firmware, the Map AI platform itself will also be open source. And so that's really important for us because, yes, we know how to build dash cams now. We've built, I think, 2 good ones. We'll build another one. But we think there's a world out there that could also be building good dash cams and good camera technology that also are great mappers, right? And so what I would like to see is this technology find itself into more vehicles, more trucks, more vans, et cetera, where mapping becomes part of the thing that those vehicles do, right? And so the people who own those vehicles participate in the creation and the maintenance of these maps on a global level. I think if we were to hold all this technology and try to charge people for it and, license the wazoo out of it, et cetera, it would make it really hard to adopt and integrate these technology into people's cars and vehicles and vans. Because look, if you're, let's say you build vans, right? Delivery vans. Are you going to rely on a proprietary technology from a startup? Like that would be insane, right? For a car that's going to be around for, maybe 10, 15, 20 years. And so I think by making it open source, you actually create a situation where it's easier to adopt, because even if Hivemapper, for whatever reason doesn't survive, that technology is not lost, and that entire map pipeline will continue to grow, via this community that is now managing and maintaining it and editing and labeling and doing all these things to it.
Right.
So, if you then say, okay, well, what do you get for that, right? Like, then you start to have a mapping collection system that is both high quality, right? Because you have standardized imagery, standardized, components and all that kind of stuff from a data collection perspective. And you also have something that I would argue is fresher than Google Maps, right? Because Google Maps only sees a location at best every 9 to 12 months, right? San Francisco is a good example of that. You go outside of, you go suburban Austin, Texas, or, suburban Paris, it's probably once every 2 to 3 years. You go to places in Nigeria, if they have it all, it's maybe every 5 to 10 years. So all of a sudden you have this mapping system that is seeing a given city, 2 to 3 times per week, right? And so I think you just have a much higher quality, much better map as a result of that. But you can't do that, in my view, as a full proprietary system. Like, you just won't get the traction.
Do you see collaborating with auto manufacturers? Because from what I understood, you were talking about like the van. That's an individual, or did I misunderstand? Like, do you see that happening at a larger scale?
Yeah. So I think like we've had some of these conversations with auto manufacturers, but they operate on 5-year cycles. So like any conversation that I'm having with you now to get something into the car is probably 5 years. So we want to start before, we get the car, all this technology integrated. So when we show up now at a conversation with auto manufacturers, they see the map that's grown, right, to 6 million unique road kilometers. To put that into perspective, I think that's 4 or 5x faster than Google Street View grew in the, to get to 6 million unique road kilometers. So they see that there's real data, that the system is working. They see the technology. And so you just have a lot more credibility than if you just show up and say, hey, can you take this thing and put it into your vehicle? That's not going to work. And then by open sourcing it, it just makes it lower risk. It makes it something that is theirs, right? They can adapt it to their needs and their capabilities and their vehicles. But as long as we say is like, look, as long as that vehicle is now mapping, right? And by the way, you also need maps, so that can be beneficial to you as well, right? So yes, ultimately, I do believe that the technology that is sitting in these dash cams will have to find its way into the vehicle itself. But that's a long process.
I think that's a nice place to start rounding it off. And I like closing these conversations also asking the same question. I like asking for a book and a podcast recommendation. And there's 2 reasons for that. The first one is a lot of these travel through word of mouth, people recommending them. And that's how I hear a lot about new books and podcasts, more than through algorithmic recommendation. And the second one is I just think it's an interesting other angle to learn about people's interest. And so it doesn't have to be about anything that we discussed here, but just something that you've read or listened to recently that you think might be of interest for people.
Well, let's see. What did I read recently? I read the Elon Musk biography by Walter Isaacson. I thought it was good. I feel like it was probably a little bit too early to write that. And given that he kind of lives in public, I didn't learn that much. Like, you have this guy who's always out there, always talking, sharing his opinion. So yeah, I think it's like interesting, but not the most interesting thing I read.
Did you read Ashley Vance's?
I didn't read his. No, and maybe that was a mistake.
I'd be curious to see how they compare. That's more in the early days. I think
you're right.
The more recent one is about more recent activities.
Yeah. And so, I mean, look, I think that the one thing that has always comes through these things, whether it be, Steve Jobs' biography or Elon Musk or anybody else's, is like perseverance is always more important than intellect. and like
Hmm.
the shit that these guys, put up with. I don't mean that put up with in the sense of like, the world. I mean, look, if you try to create new things, it is very, very natural for the world to say, we don't want that new thing. Like that's just the way the world works. And so, but yeah, when you're trying to do something on that scale, the level of perseverance that you have to have is obviously quite high, and the tolerance for pain that you have to have is quite high. So it's always a good reminder, especially kind of as we're trying to build our own thing here. In terms of a podcast, there's one with this guy Noah Smith. I think it's called. It's still relatively small, but I think it's called like Econ 101 or something like that. And he, I don't agree with Noah. The nice thing about Noah is I don't agree with everything about him, but I think he's very thoughtful, and
I appreciate that.
he's not dogmatic, and he's willing to change his mind and explain to you like why he changed his mind. And it's fascinating. He's like one of these guys who used to be, I think, obviously he was trained as an economist. He then went to work for Bloomberg, and he was a writer. And he was a very good writer, but then he decided to basically strike out on his own. And now he has like a newsletter that is doing very well. And he has like, I think he participates in, I think, one or two podcasts that are also doing very well. And so he's pretty fascinating. I think that independence, right? He's not writing for Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal or New York Times. And so I think he can be a little bit more, let's see, he doesn't have to follow the dogma or the political view of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever. He has his own ideas and he doesn't care. And he has enough money now, like he makes enough money and he has his audience that it's great. I think that's very, very powerful, right? And I think what you're doing also, like in the mapping world, is also very powerful, where you can bring together ideas. You don't work for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, where you have to ask certain questions or maybe present things in a specific way because that is in tune with, the dogma of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times.
I think journalism has changed quite a lot on that front through, interestingly enough, I think through tech as well. Things like Substack have really allowed writers to make a living, kind of going independent like that. I think, I don't know, maybe I'm seeing it too much through the lens of tech, but I feel like that ability for people to make a living through their writing, that was a lot more complicated before, and that really opened up, from what I understand, people like him to kind of branch out on their own. And I think that has led to maybe a bit more of a fragmentation, but more independence. And I think that's probably a better thing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think the unfortunate part is you have the situation right now where, folks like Noah, folks like, Ben from Stratchery, folks like yourself, et cetera, who are these independent voices, are really trying to understand the technology, right? Really trying to understand the use cases and the applications, the good things about it, maybe some of the negative things about it. And whereas I think the, folks like in the New York Times, I'll pick on them here for a moment, like they have a really difficult time seeing anything positive in the technology world, right? Their lens have been so clouded by whatever's happening in that organization, where they can't see the positive aspects of technology. I think we can all agree that, technology is technology, and it's going to have its positives and it's going to have its negatives. And so, that I think is unfortunate as a whole, especially for kind of that next generation of, entrepreneurs, of technologists, of people who really, are passionate about this, is they're starting to view technology in some cases as like a bad thing, right?
Right. So do you see a lack of optimism?
100%. Like that lack of optimism, that lack of, I mean, just even how they present the SpaceX launches for the Starship, right? Like it failed. Well, if you know anything about technology, you know that it's an iterative cycle, right? And you deploy a piece of technology, it's going to have all its issues, and then you figure out what went wrong, why it went wrong, and then you fix it, and then you come back and you do another version, another version, another version, right? Like there is no technology that has ever gone from like not a thing to like a perfect thing and skipped all the steps in between, right? And so I think if they were to, explain that, right, and put this into context, I think that would be better. That's the accurate truth. And B, that would be beneficial to that next generation to say, look, this is about perseverance, right? What did they learn from this launch that they can then figure out how to improve for the next launch, right? And then grade them on whether or not they fix those things.
I feel like there's always been people like that. Do you think this is new, or it's just more prominent today?
I think that something changed. It's a good question. I think that something changed after after the Facebook chaos, social media chaos, where I think Facebook, when at least here in the United States, so I'm talking a little bit more United States centric because I realize your audience is global, but in 2009, 2010, when Obama was elected, social media was hailed as like, holy, it was amazing. It was this amazing tool utilized by incredible new leaders of the United States, like Barack Obama, to kind of bring this message of optimism and hope to a wider audience and, unseat the existing incumbent power and so forth, right? So it was hailed as a very, very positive thing. Then you turn around and, there was obviously social media was used in nefarious ways. And then it was like social media is total crap. This thing is just gross. It's disgusting. Like, we need to bar it. We need to regulate it, like everything. Like, how did we switch that quickly? Like, this piece of technology went from being like amazing to now all of a sudden, not only that technology is bad, but a lot of the technology is bad, and technology is bad for society as a whole. And so I think that viewpoint has become, unfortunately, pervasive. You're starting to see this at least here in the United States, in that younger generation who don't view that technology with the same level of optimism that I grew up with. My dad is a professor, of material science and engineering. So like, I grew up with technology, you can solve problems with technology, right? You can create new things with technology, right? And you got to figure out what problem you want to solve that really speaks to you. But technology is a force for the positive in this world. And I just worry a little bit, is like, are people still growing up with that sense of hope around technology?
Yeah, I wonder about that as well. I think optimism has a bit of a bad name these days. I'm also a little bit confused as to why, but I think historically, if you look at a lot of things, like, the optimists tend to be the ones that come across, like, lead to change. I don't know. I think optimism is pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people would be like, there's a sense of like some people like, and this is not a political statement. I think this cuts across age groups. I think this cuts across, political groups and so forth, is like people almost like want to turn the clock back, want to go back to like living in the 1920s, the 1930s. And I was like, I don't think you really want like, it was not all great. And, like you read in the history books, or like at least how it's like shown, in terms of media today, like your life right now is so much better, right? And even if you're not wealthy, right? Even if you're kind of like middle income, like your life is so much better and so much wealthier than somebody even from, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And so I think that like context is missing. And so I think that leads people to like, view the world in a very negative way, unfortunately. So I don't think we're going to solve. I think it's good to have new voices like yours and like Noah's and others kind of fill that vacuum that kind of maybe traditional media has left behind, unfortunately.
Well, I really do appreciate you spending some of your valuable time with me and sharing the history of what you've done and what you're trying to build, and kind of answering all the questions I've had for it. So I very much appreciate that.
Thank you, Max. It's been awesome.